Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a frontline update, Ukraine war frontline update for the 16th of July 2025. I last did one on the 11th of July, so this is a 5-day update. Expect quite a few changes because it's a 5-day update. Also expect quite a few changes because I think the Russians are really pushing at the moment. I'm wondering whether the 50 days that Trump has given them to get things done, depends how you interpret that. But some are arguing that 10 days or thereabouts before Trump made that announcement, Putin had asked for 60 days. He said, you know, for these gains he's going to make. Then a little bit later, Trump says he's going to give them 50 days or else to get a peace deal done. And many are saying, well, he's doing what Putin wants him to do, which is giving him this time to get as much achieved as possible. And that's what it's looking like because the Russians are really pushing, and worryingly so in a few places, Pokrovsk being one of them. We're going to go, as we normally do, to start up in the north and around Sumy and Techino. So it's been, I think, a case of the Russians possibly trying to push back in this area. We've had some success for the Ukrainians around Kindrativka particularly, and actually we're going to see some more success there. Although you can see no changes since the last mapping update, but Andrew Perpetua shows with his pink pins where the Russian defensive lines previously were. Surat Maps, the pro-Russian mapper, shows where the Russian defensive lines were previously with his puce coloured ones, cherry red pins. So you can see both mappers are showing that the Russians have made advances in the Sumy area and then going a little bit further to the east as well, down to an area where the Ukrainians were still kind of holding out a little bit in Kursk. But we're going to start in Techino. The Russians, according to Surat Maps, have pushed the Ukrainians right back here. Now, I'm not sure that that's going to be the case. I mean, there's been fighting in Techino that's been really tough. The Ukrainians have put the Russians under a lot of pressure because they've cut off this supply route coming in here. But it does look like the Russians are countering, but they seem to be countering more over here by the border along further to the east, and particularly around Novi Put, where they seem to have pushed the Ukrainians back out of there, which is just a tiny hamlet the other side of the border. That's according to Andrew Perpetua. Now, if you remember, we saw a significant strike on some buildings in Techino from some guided glide bombs used by the Ukrainians there at a command post. That's a significant building. I think that's in this kind of area somewhere around here, these larger buildings up there, pretty much in the center where they've been fighting. Andrew Perpetua has this area as a grey zone. In fact, if we go to his map, you'll get a better sense. So you've got a grey zone around here. You've got an airstrike there, and we've got some shelling going on back here. So that airstrike is almost certainly going to be, that large building. It's on actually that corner there. The drone footage looking at the building is actually looking at the building from basically over here, northwest of the building, and looking back in that direction, as you can see here, and it's that corner getting taken out. So that is over in this kind of general area. Surat Maps has the Russians pushing the Ukrainians right back to the border. That's not how Andrew Perpetua sees it, and he sees actually some of these areas in robust control of the Ukrainians, with grey zone most elsewhere. But there's been an awful lot of fighting for a very long time here, and no significant movement for some weeks, which shows how tough it is. It's quite a settlement, as in there's a lot of buildings here and some industrial areas and commercial areas and all sorts to fight over. So there are a number of places the Russians can hang out for a quite a long time, even if they are struggling with supply due to the Ukrainian drones and whatnot. So yeah, it is that's where it's at. And as you can see here, like I was just saying, Andrew Perpetua claiming that the Russians are making a push back towards the border, just to the east here. So that's over in this area. That's what I was talking about. Okay, so Techino, there seems to be some fighting there. The Russians could be trying to maybe cause some problems for the Ukrainians further to the east that gets them to be distracted from Techino. We've got Novi Put being taken back, and I wonder what the data is for that. No, just no data, just it's, as you can see from that darker patch of red, that's what the Russians have taken. Then when we come further to the east, this is the Sumy region. I'll show you Andrew Perpetua's map first, because you can just see drone attacks from the Russians, a lot of drone attacks and cluster MRL shelling as well. Actually, this is airstrikes and multiple launch rocket systems. Those aren't drones. I thought that was the icon for drones, which is this one. It looks very similar there from a distance. So we've got a Ukrainian YPR 765 damaged there. We've got another YPR 765 damaged over there. So Kindrativka, which is this settlement here, fully under control of the Ukrainians, as according to Andrew Perpetua, and that's they clearly have presence pretty much right throughout Kindrativka. If the Russians are using MLRS to bomb the crap out of it, they're not going to be doing that to their own troops. And they are shelling right along, or giving airstrikes actually, right along this road, which suggests that the Ukrainians might be pushing up to Konstantinivka way there. But the Russians are pushing back as well along here. They are attacking back and have had some success going further to the east. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my map. So as we come along here, we have this section of the Sumy region, the sector, and this is up here, the border, the Russian-Ukrainian border. All of this area here is area that the Russians now control. They were pushing south. Remember, they were trying to get to this area here, the forested area, so they could have artillery placed all up along here on the flatlands, and then shelling Sumy with wild abandon. Now the Ukrainians stopped the Russians and have been pushing the Russians back, and there were claims that actually they were getting close to pushing the Russians back to the border up at the western flank here, this left flank, but it could be that the Russians have brought in more reinforcements. It could be that North Koreans are active there. We've heard that they're bringing people from Zaporizhia to the area. Okay, let's go then to some of these sources. What do we have here? So the 425th Scala Regiment likely liberated Kindrativka, and this is what we're seeing from at least Andrew Perpetua. According to R.U. Radov, the Russian 30th Regiment and 40th Marines left the operational encirclement as the 22nd and 9th Regiment and 155th Marines were unable to unblock it. Heavy fighting continues. So there were claims that the Russians were basically they're having a bit of a nightmare. Russian sources were saying this themselves. So although Suret map seems to have the Russians still in control of over half of Kindrativka, particularly in this southern area, most other mappers don't have that, and that the Russians were really in a lot of trouble. They were broadly encircled. They were having real trouble supplying, because part of the reason why they're having trouble supplying Kindrativka, because if you look north of Kindrativka, you've got this kind of river lake setup. So these are all sort of little river areas. Generally, when you see physical geography like this, these will be the course of little tributaries, which will have more vegetation along them, and they'll be deeper. So there might be embankments there, and not quite. They're not valleys, obviously, but little, not even gorges, but sort of deeper areas of land. Now, if you're fighting over Kindrativka and you're being beaten back as Russians, you are going to need to supply your guys with ammunition, water, food, and troops, and rotate troops and all sorts. Well, you can't get to Kindrativka anywhere from the east or the northeast or the north, right? So all of this is cut off, because you're going to have to negotiate these rivers and whatnot. There are no roads. And so really you're talking about coming from the northwest. Well, this road is going to be, under control of the Ukrainians, or completely under fire control from mortars, shelling, and drones. And this is why Kindrativka turned out to be a nightmare for the Russians. And they were making all these complaints. 155th, which has already had its hierarchy decimated up in Koronovo, so just north of here, this whole Kursk area. So you got Glushkova over there, you've got Koronova up there. So that is where they're operating the command out of for this kind of area, and that got hit by, thought to be HIMARS, killing at least 7 of the command there, including I think the top commander and other, right at the top, absolutely decimated them. So that's going to hurt the Russians in terms of how they go about defending this area. So Andrew Perpetua, I don't know, that's a rejig, or whether the Russians have been pushing back in Andriivka. But what the Ukrainians would like to do is, cut the Russians off all along here, or take all of these places, Oleksivka, Andriivka, and Kindrativka. I mean, Andriivka is going to be hard to supply as well, apart from, really from the next door Oleksivka. So I would have thought the Ukrainians could really be very hopeful about taking these places. They've taken Kindrativka, so will they move on to Andriivka? So let's look at some of these. Vizhina, this is going back a few days though, the 13th, 3 days. On the Sumy front in the Khutin direction, Ukrainian forces continue their advance, regaining additional positions in the village of Kindrativka following the operational encirclement of the Russian garrison in the southern and central parts of Kindrativka. Ukrainian troops went on to seize agricultural facilities in the western part of the village, along with the remaining enemy possessions located in the southern tree line. Well, it actually seems like they've taken all of it now. Moreover, southeast of Oleksivka, the front line has shifted in Ukraine's favour, with Ukrainian units now in control of 3 separate tree lines located on tactical high ground that had previously been under Russian control. So that's over. So I'm just going to go back to my map. That's going to be over here. This kind of area in the grey zone, taking control of some key areas there. Let's just put that on the map. So that's just over here. So Surat Maps has that under control of the Russians. Vision are there, I think, suggesting that the Russian control is much further back. In fact, it looks a lot more like Andrew Perpetua's map. It's not identical, but they seem to be in alignment, whereas Surat Maps isn't quite on it there. What else do we have? Kindrativka, yep. So we saw more and more of that getting taken back. You can see the size of the Russian control there, and that was going back to the 13th. And then we had this on the 16th, so that's yesterday, and you can see that the size of the Russian controlled part has got smaller. Ukrainians taking more, and actually many now claiming that all of that is now under Russian control. Here you can see no reports suggesting that all of it is under control, or is at least grey zone. None of it is controlled by the Russians. And actually that goes for Andriivka as well. So Ukrainian forces have advanced further into Kindrativka, now pushing out the remaining Russian troops from the village. A small strategic gain right on the border. What else do we have? Yeah, so then we're going to push a little bit further to the east now. So some claimed advances from Surat Maps in Yunakivka there, as the Russians, he claims, or they claim, control most of that settlement. That's not confirmed at all by Andrew Perpetua, and in fact the map looks very different there in terms of what's going on in that settlement. But then when we come further to the east, we do have a little bit of a problem here for the Ukrainians, as they are being pushed right out of the remaining areas of Kursk, where Andrew Perpetua still had them and still has some grey zone around here, around the Gornau Monastery area, but actually has the Russians having quite a bit of land under their control. There are no settlements there, but right up to pretty much the border area there. So yeah, this was the last remnants of the Ukrainians being in Kursk from their Kursk incursion. And then we come over to a place called Kucherov, and Andrew Perpetua, as you can see, has the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back inside, again, inside the Oblast, inside their own territory here in Kursk. It's not quite Belgorod. Belgorod starts just there. So very close to the Belgorod border, but this is still Kursk. And we have that detailed in a couple of these maps. This is Grayskull. The Ukrainians broke into the Kursk area once again. So this could be trying to keep the Russians on their toes, getting them to be distracted, to having to think about over here. So distracted maybe from this main point over here, or maybe all the way over in the Andriivka and Kindrativka area. So yeah, it gives the Russians something to think about. Maybe widens this area out so that you don't have a pocket that's surrounded there. I don't know what the exact reasons are, but the Ukrainians are certainly pushing into Russian territory in another place. So again, here we have Visioner saying settlement of Kucherov in Russia's Kursk region. The Ukrainians have captured another forest area there. Okay, so this is kind of one of the areas where, although the Russians seem to be pushing back, and I think that is significant, and it doesn't surprise me. I would think this is quite embarrassing. Not embarrassing, but the Russians really wanted to continue on down to take Sumy, and they put a lot of effort into manning this area. I think the Ukrainians have done a really good job of taking out key positions, key command posts in, as I've already mentioned, Koronovo, but also you've got Lugov that gets hit, and particularly Rilsk routinely gets absolutely hammered. Well, I say absolutely hammered, but actually I mean pinpoint hammered. Like certain places are taken out very precisely using HIMARS and other weapons, no doubt. And that, I think, is a really good way of stopping the Russians having more success right on the front lines. We are also hearing that the Russians may be giving the Ukrainians something to think about down in the Kharkiv Oblast, coming across the border at a place called Milove, which is a real shame for the Ukrainians, something else to think about. And that is further to the east from Vovchansk, so these two areas in Kharkiv. We have no change there, but the Russians pushing in here. So each side seems to be playing a game of whack-a-mole, or like forcing the other side to play whack-a-mole. Where you're coming up in different places, forcing the defensive side, in whatever context it is, to have to react. And if you're forcing them to react, then they can't do what they want to do, particularly in these given areas. So it's about initiative here. Now, the Russians really pushing a lot north of Kupiansk and around the Kupiansk area, although Surat Maps has the Russians being pushed back in a place called it's not Kindrativka, it's Kindrativka, which is north of Kupiansk. That could be some rejigging, quite different mapping interpretation between the two mappers there. But generally, it's thought that the Russians are, really pressuring around the Kupiansk area. And you can see a couple of areas, both north and east of there, that the Russians are having some advances in. This is across the Oskil River, right in the north there. What you don't want the Russians to do is start sort of joining these things up, and they eat, piece by piece, take parts of Ukraine that will then have to be negotiated back to the Ukrainians, because it's unlikely that the Ukrainians are going to have military success in each one of these places. They'll just be spread too thinly. Then when we come down to the Torsk-Kuturny area, 5 days, not a great amount of change there, but this is thought to be one place where the Russians are advancing. If you look at the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank synopsis of activity, they say, and this was from last night, so they stopped, usefully actually, they put the cutoff time, which is 12 p.m. ET, so Eastern Standard Time, which means my time, that's going to be 5 in the afternoon. And then they usually publish that some hours later. So it usually comes out the night before. I'm talking about my time. So it might take them 5 or 6 hours to put it together, and then they produce it. So by the time they say this stuff, it's often a little bit out of date if you're really thinking about wanting the very most recent information. But it's a really good synopsis of what's going on. And they said in yesterday's report that the Ukrainian forces advanced themselves in Sumy Oblast, like we just looked at, although the Russians may have been pushing back there. Russian forces advanced in Kupiansk area, Borova and Toretsk. So the Kupiansk area is broadly here, where we just were up there, and then the Borova area is there's Borova, which is the Oskil River. So remember, the Oskil River comes down from Kupiansk down here. They've reached the Oskil River in what I call the Pischany sector, and in the Borova direction, they're making advances. That could actually be Torsk-Kuturny. This is what I call this area here. where the Russians are having some success in the northern part there. But actually for 5 days, it's not too bad at all. In fact, this whole sector, that's all right for the Ukrainians. Now, it's when you get further to the south that it becomes a bit of a worry. Okay, let's move on. Just making sure that I did all of the, yeah. So coming on to, first of all, we're going to go, well, should we go to Seversk? Let's just look in general at what is going on in terms of defences. And I was going to wait to Kharkiv, but now I've done Kharkiv. I almost forgot. So in this jet, somewhere in this area, I showed you a video this morning of this, and these are just a couple of stills from the video from Playfra taking these stills and talking about them a little bit. This is in a Kharkiv Oblast somewhere where you have, and I talked about these not being zigzag, these are substantial trenches, and because they're not zigzag, I think these are all vehicle trenches. So and there's 3 of them, it looks, and then inside the trenches they've got concertina wire, then they've got I don't know if that's Dragon's Teeth or more wire going down there, probably Dragon's Teeth. I mean, these are substantial. They are fairly straight, so this is about stopping vehicles. And there was talk about, and I discussed this in my video, Hits and Losses video, go and check that out from this morning. There was talk about how if you're retreating to these as Ukrainians, so say you're coming from the right and you're being pushed back by the Russians, you need to be able to get across this. Otherwise, these become the very obstacle that you have built them for against the Russians. They become your obstacle because you're being chased backwards. So you need roads over these. And indeed, where the imagery is being taken from here, where the photographer or the cameraman is actually on one of these kind of roads. But if it's a long way from one road to the next, then you are funneled into these areas as you are retreating, and it becomes an area where you can be sort of ambushed by drones and whatnot by the Russians in this case. And that then becomes an issue. So on the one hand, you want more of these ways to get across, but then on the other hand, you don't want more of these ways to get across because otherwise the Russians are using when you're defending. So these become an issue when you are retreating, these defenses. I mean, that's just the nature of them. And it's very, very difficult to know what to do about that. But anyway, so this is one of the tank ditches with concertina wire and some metal posts put in there. And you can see that these might be pretty effective, especially if you've got 3 of them. They're fairly deep. You're going to have engineering vehicles placing, bridge laying vehicles, placing some equipment to get across there, which is not particularly difficult if you've got that equipment. Do the Russians have that equipment? Yes, they do. Do they have enough of them? Who knows? But all the while they're doing that, you as the defenders are hopefully going to be hitting them with artillery, maybe even mortars, certainly drones. So that is good to see. Well thought out defences. Playfra says great line of defence somewhere in Kharkiv. 1, barbed wire. 2, anti-tank ditch. 3, Dragon's Teeth and barbed wire. It might be concertina wire. There is a difference. I always used to call all wire barbed wire, but actually concertina wire I think is sharper just all round. You don't have the barbs, and I think it's just more of a problem. Anti-tank ditch and barbed wire. Anti-tank ditch and barbed wire. So you've got wire, anti-tank ditch, Dragon's Teeth, and 2 more anti-tank ditches, and then Patanka tangling wire. So different type of wire there as well. Now, I don't know which. I was assuming the right, so it must be a type of wire that's anti-tank. I was assuming the Russians are on the right and the Ukrainians on the left, but actually it could be the other way round. It just depends which orientation the photos are taken from. So it could be the Russians are actually to the left of this picture, and they'd have to, the Dragon's Teeth are only after 1 ditch rather than after 2 ditches. So there is that. Something else to mention as we get into this area. So this is Rodinsky in the Pokrovsk, on the Pokrovsk road a week ago, destroyed anti-drone nets. So we've seen these anti-drone nets, and they do, serve a function. They are useful, but they, when you lose them, you lose them. And you're not going to fix them very easily because, do you know what? They take a lot of effort to put those things up. And if you're right near the contact line, if the enemy is advanced close to here, then you hang on a second, I just need to put some nets up. Meanwhile, drones are slamming into you left, right and centre. So that's kind of what Playfra says here. As you can see, they were indeed set up, but as you know, the Russians were able to get very close to it and increase by much the number of drones, which rendered repairs impossible. Regarding Druskivka and Konstantinivka, we're going to skip a little bit around here because actually we're not going to go there yet, but I am just for the sake of the claims here. So you've got Pokrovsk, which is getting encircled, and it's looking very hairy here indeed. Not immediately around Pokrovsk, but this northern area, that's a real that's a bit of a shocker there. But anyway, we're talking about Konstantinivka, Druskivka, you've got Kramatorsk, you've got Sloviansk. These are getting absolutely shellacked at the moment by Russian Shahid drones, but also all sorts of other stuff, including I think multiple launch rocket systems and so on and so forth. Okay, so Playfar says, regarding Druskivka and Konstantinivka, they tell me that there's still not enough, but this does not mean they're useless. They saved more than one car and life and should be placed on every major artery supplying the front. Agree. Definitely useful to have these things. It's just forethought, isn't it, and resources. There was always the issue with the Ukrainians as who's responsible. Is it the state? Is it the military? Is it which unit of the military? So on and so forth. Who pays for this? Who? And then in the end, they weren't built enough, and then everyone's blaming each other. It should have just happened. Right, we're going to go to Seversk, which is this front line here. So, okay, let me just not jump around too much. Sorry, sometimes it automatically, for some reason, zooms in. So we were just at the Turska area here. Then we come down to the Kremina, the Serebyansky forest there. And then we have the Seversk front line just down here with the town of Seversk being encroached upon by the Russians as they come through Verkhnokamianska and maybe from the north at the Serebyansky forest as they're coming just along the Seversky Donetsk River. Now, as you can see, a massive difference of opinion between Suryat Maps and Andrew Perpetua. Suryat Maps, a pro-Russian mapper, just says just changes the map depending on whatever the Russian MOD say. Now, nonetheless, it's going to be challenging around here as it is everywhere along the front line. So what do we have about this first direction? Well, Playfry here says, at Verkhnokamianska, the front looks approximately like this. So let's have a look at that down here. What we have is this kind of, this lake reservoir, whatever it is. There we have the town here. Suryat Maps has only the very westerly area of the town, not even under Ukrainian control, but no doubt grey zone, and the Russians fully controlling most of the town there. Now, Playfar obviously doesn't have that at all. So we have the Russians in control of maybe half of the town here, but they're not coming all the way along the north and north of that reservoir, as you can see from my map here. So Suryat Maps has the Russians right along there. That doesn't seem to be the case. Okay. Now, and it's certainly not from Andrew Perpetua's point of view. It has the Russians way back here. So the map that Playfar's proposing is kind of somewhere in between Andrew Perpetua and Suryat Maps here. Seversk direction at Verkhnokamianska, the front looks approximately like this. Russians solidly control the eastern part of the settlement, but can't make it can't make it to the western side without being hit by drones. They weren't even able to raise a single flag in the western half there, he says. So that's what's going on there. Right, then we're going to come down to, we're going to come past Chazy Vyar, not spend too long there. There are some claims that around Orikovo, Vasilivka, or just south of there, the Ukrainians are being pushed back by the Russians as they are moving through Hirivka. But they have reached the canal there, arguably, or very near to it. So hopefully the Ukrainians can use that as a defense. Then we come past Chazy Vyar, no change there. That's good news. And then Toretsk. Right, Toretsk is tough. Now, some are claiming that the Ukrainians aren't still in Toretsk, but others are claiming that they are. As you can see, there's a massive difference of opinion between the two mappers here. Might be worth having a look at Andrew Perpetua's actual map here to see what evidence there is, because it's not just about, lines on a map, but it's about the evidence for those lines on the map, and the evidence for the lines on the map are all of these icons that Andrew has. So, when you are claiming that the that the Ukrainians might not be in Toretsk at all, then it's worth looking at, what the Russians bombing. Ukrainian Vampire drone intercepted. Interesting. Russian attack. Grodzika destroyed. Ukrainian self-propelled howitzer there destroyed, and so on and so forth. So not too much. Might be worth going back a day, see if there's anything else. No, but here we have Russian fun with flags, and that's what we're going to talk about in a second. That's further down to the southwest around Leonidivka, and in this area, Shcherbynivka. I think this is where Azov are active there, trying to hold the Russians back there. Okay, so fun with flags as he has it. So here we have the Russians, going back to my map, pressing all throughout Toretsk. I mean, whatever your opinion is, it's clear that Toretsk is mainly under control of the Russians, and the Ukrainians really have been pushed back there as of late, and that's putting pressure on Konstantinivka, of course. So just on that front, here we have. So this is on my map. This is here. Right, so this is where we're talking about sort of moving up here, Leonidivka, and up into Shcherbynivka there. Okay, so according to Playfra, slightly more of this area is under Russian control. But he's like, you have to kind of understand what he's talking about here. Oh, have I got both of them? So basically, there were claims from the Russians. I don't know if it's in this one. Yes, okay. So you're going to have to join the dots a little bit with what he's saying. But essentially, what he's saying is that the Russians claimed to have put flags somewhere. But what they did is they spliced some videos together with some flag raising. And as they zoomed out, it cut to zooming out from another place, as if they planted the flag in that place. But actually, it wasn't, and they were claiming to have planted flags here, and we've heard the Russians doing this before, possibly as a kind of way of being able to report to bosses that they have taken these areas, and then they get patted on the back for that. But the problem is then you have to eventually somewhere down the line have to actually be in control of that place, because then your bosses expect you to be taking the next place. You're not even in control of the first place. So anyway, Voskresenka here, the Russian flags were proven not to have been recorded in Voskresenka. The video was edited and cut, first showing Russian soldiers waving flags in a different place, and immediately after zooming out to show Voskresenka, the area was returned to the previous contact line configuration. The Russians advanced in Novospaska. Okay, so that is to say that, as far as I can work out here, this was the area that the Russians were claiming to control, and then it wasn't actually true. So interesting that Andrew Perpetua has this area being taken by the Russians now, with the previous defensive line all the way back here in Leonidivka. So that is a significant area of land that they have taken, considering it's quite urban. Weirdly, Surat Maps doesn't have that. So Surat Maps' defensive line for the Russians is here, and that's why we've got this clear gap here, because it's one of those rare occasions where Surat Maps has the Russian advances further back than Andrew Perpetua. And Andrew Perpetua's Russian defensive line is this blue line here. Anyway, that's why it looks like that in that area. Just seeing, yeah. Petrivka Novospaska is 2/3 lost. Eastern Shcherbynivka is lost. Toretsk Forest is lost. The front line, at least from Katyinivka to Toretsk, is almost 100% accurate. This is what I was allowed to share. So this came from the 13th, though. So this is some time back. So that is to say that he's talking about this area where Andrew Perpetua has the Russians controlling. So saying that this forest area is under a lot of trouble, and it's the Shcherbynivka over here. Essentially, you've got a pocket of Ukrainian resistance here, but that's going to be slightly problematic if the Russians can get up here and you can start thinking about closing these necks, either this one on the right or this one on the left, and then all the Ukrainians left in there and in there are in trouble, particularly this side where it's more urban. You're going to have more, if that's where the Azov are, then, you know, you've got real crack troops then left in a lot of trouble. Okay, then... Right, Yablunivka. Okay, let's go on to there. So let's look at a few other, this is Yablunivka, a few other places here. So Surat Maps has the Russians making some gains towards Katyinivka. A really big difference between the two mappers there. And actually the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back in one of these areas, Kalinove, Alexandria Kalinove there. So good news for the Ukrainians there. Right, this is where we get on to probably the worst part of the front line for the Ukrainians, because this is deeply concerning. So not only are they getting up north and therefore surrounding Konstantinivka even more, and they're pushing, you know, Chansiv Yar, of course. Konstantinivka becomes more and more surrounded, which means you're starting to worry about how you supply Konstantinivka, and that's a pretty major place, right? So you've got this main supply route coming out. You've got some other sort of roads here and there. But nothing as major as that one. And yeah, as the Russians get closer, that becomes a problem. Then you have this kind of same happening with Pokrovsk as they're coming to the north of Pokrovsk, and this is a real worry because they're starting to be able to cut this road off. Then as they have taken more and more of this land to the south, and Scruffy Tails talks about this, this allows them to get artillery much more easily here, right? So before, the Ukrainians were pushing the Russians back here, like only sort of 6 weeks ago, and maybe a little bit more. Solone, the Ukrainians were pushing at Uspanivka, Solone, Kotlina, really pushing the Russians back, and that meant that their artillery had to be much further back. But now the Russians have reversed that and are now taking quite a bit of land in this area. They can place their artillery here and have a crack at Pokrovsk more easily, have a crack at these supply routes into Pokrovsk. So you've got these roads that are starting to be attacked by the Russians. So you're thinking, well, it's probably this one. You can't really see it very easily, but the one that comes through, what's it called, the 0525 there. So this one coming through the settlement of Horishna might well be the main supply route, and these major yellow roads there are just in all sorts of trouble. So that's a real worry. Anyway, that's what's kind of broadly what's going on in the Pokrovsk area. We're going to go Yablunivka. Okay, so swing back here. This is now southwest of Konstantinivka. Remember, Konstantinivka, Druskivka, so on and so forth. Chansiv Yar over here, Konstantinivka, Toretsk down here. We've got a small settlement called Yablunivka. We're just going to have play for our talk about that. So Yablunivka, the situation worsened significantly since my last report today. 6 Russians dismounted in Alexandro Kalinove. So interestingly, that's where the Surat Maps has the Ukrainians countering there and either rejigging a map or having a counterattack. Now, the Ukrainians were not able to eliminate all of them in Yablunivka itself. The Russians are pushing along the main street and are encountering little Ukrainian resistance because of lack of men. Russian forces now reach the road that goes to Stepanivka and control everything up to there until the junction. So this is particularly worrying. So it's talking about this road up here, which is to say, I presume that's over here, controlling stuff up there. I'm pretty sure that's where we are on the map. Up to the junction, which would be maybe that junction there, but I'm not 100% sure. So many places on this map. Anyway, there you go. So really worrying stuff around here as the Ukrainians are being pushed back all along this front. This whole area between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, the Russians are having the most joy, I think, just taking land. And it gets particularly worrying if, I think there's a river over here. If they can get across the river that comes down here, I think possibly around Rozina. I think this river course comes along here. Then it becomes even easier for them. and you look how close they are to the north of Myrnograd. Really, that is your big area of concern over there. And elsewhere, of course, they're still making advances, which is a problem. I mean, you can see all these pins over here. I just don't think it's as meaningful over here because there's nowhere like Pokrovsk. But it's the problem. The Russians are still making those gains along this Donetsk, southern part of the Donetsk front here, before you start getting onto Zaporizhia. So yeah, that's quite a bit of gain for the Russians. I just don't think it's as important as this gain up here, because that presents problems for both Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk and Myrnograd. Yeah, so the Ukrainians are going to have to think about this very hard. I don't know how... we see a lot of guided glide bomb usage up in places like Techino, northern border areas. I'm just trying to think, I would be just throwing everything I could at these positions. I saw some guided glide bomb strikes. I think I've got them for tomorrow's video, hits and losses video, along tree lines. So it's interesting that they're not just hitting big buildings and command posts, but actually they're using them as almost like close air support. Considerable bombs being dropped on the Russians in their forwardmost points there. Okay, and then I think that's all I've got in terms of the different sources. We have, tiny little gains around Marfapil there, and some other gains for the Russians as well. And then over in Kamyanska, by the Zaporizhia reservoir, or at least as it was, some small gains for the Russians too. That is worrying. This could be one of the areas that they are focusing on in the summer. I think it gets them closer to Zaporizhia. If they can get close to Zaporizhia, then that's a real major city being hit by multiple launch rockets and artillery and whatnot. So, the Ukrainians definitely don't want to let the Russians get any further than there, really. Okay, that's enough from me. Hopefully that all made sense. So some elements of good news, but actually the Russians may be pushing back in the areas where we've previously had good news, Techino and Sumy. And, I think they're really just throwing everything in the kitchen sink at making these gains in the next 50 days. Trump has given them a signal. You've got 50 days, mate. Go for it. And so, yeah, there you go. Anyway, let me know what you think. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.